So, Tekken 7 is finally here, and it brings about the culmination in the Mishima storyline. That's 2 decades worth of Tekken titles spread across 4 generations of consoles. And I thought, wow, it's a great time to go back and take a look at see how the series has evolved over time, right from its beginnings on PlayStation 1 hardware all the way up to this latest installment on PlayStation 4. Hello, I'm Dave, and I invite you to join me as we take a look at the Tekken franchise. So let's begin with the original game. After Virtua Fighter designer Saishi Ishii left Sega, taking along a few key staff with him to Namco, they began working on prototyping 3D characters, which eventually became this, the original Tekken title. This is kind of an experiment of sorts, Namco's first fully fledged 3D fighting game and rival to Virtua Fighter. At the time, 3D fighting games were relatively unproven, and with Tekken being a brand new franchise, Namco decided to use low-cost hardware in order to bring the game to the arcades, in this case the original PlayStation hardware. The System 11 arcade board uses almost exactly the same technology found in Sony's PlayStation 1, bar one particular tweak, double the amount of video memory. With the use of more affordable hardware in the arcade, this means that advanced 3D visuals were off the cards, at least when compared to Virtua Fighter 2 or a number of other Model 2 fighting games. Instead, Namco had to work around the constraints of PlayStation hardware, using clever shading and lighting techniques in order to disguise low polygon counts while still producing a visually alluring game, at least for its time. The original Tekken runs at 320 by 240 resolution and features a relatively low number of polygons. It's an early 3D fighting game, and at this point you get the sense that Namco are still feeling their way around the PlayStation hardware and 3D development in general, at least in terms of producing human character models. Using PlayStation 1 hardware rules out any exotic complex 3D backgrounds compared to, say, Virtua Fighter 2. Instead, Namco use a combination of polygons on the characters along with flat wallpapers for the background. In this case, digitized photographs and CGI used for the main backgrounds. The characters themselves use relatively few polygons. However, Namco addressed this through the use of light sourcing and a technique known as garage shading, which essentially smooths over those polygon edges, meaning that the blockiness you get in, say, Saturn Virtua Fighter is completely absent here. The use of light sourcing also ensures that the presentation features a decent amount of depth. Of course, it is basic stuff compared to what we see in the later games in the franchise, but at the time when you compare it to the likes of the Saturn version of Virtua Fighter or even to Shinden on the PlayStation, Tekken offered up a more refined presentation in general, and it was also the first home console 3D fighting game to run at 60 frames per second, whereas both Shinden and Virtua Fighter were running at 30 FPS. The familiar Tekken gameplay is also present here, albeit in a simplified form. Basic chain combos and juggles are present, though not fully fleshed out yet. Overall, there's a sense that the original Tekken is kind of an experiment, a beginning if you will, something that Namco would later build on and transform into its own unique fighting game series that sets it apart from the likes of Virtua Fighter and Dead or Alive. The original Tekken provides a solid start for the franchise, even if some aspects of the game are rather unrefined. But this is something Namco would tackle head-on with the sequel, Tekken II. Released in late 1995, the game continues to use the System 11 PlayStation-based arcade hardware, so in that respect we're not looking at, say, a generational leap in visual quality, but what we do get is a refinement across the board in terms of both graphics, gameplay and sound. So, in terms of the basics, yes, the game's still running in native 240p, and in terms of the backgrounds, we're still looking at two-dimensional wallpapers. But it's in the area of character modelling and lighting effects where there are dramatic changes to be found. For a start, the character models appear far more natural, body parts are more in proportion, and generally you can see how Namco are starting to find the series' trademark art style here. What I find really interesting though is the switch in lighting model. The original Tekken uses garage shading on the characters, enabling for smoothly lit polygons, whereas in this sequel Namco switched to flat shading instead. This does mean that you can see the individual polygon edges, and as a result the characters appear more blocky than they did in the original game, but on the flip side the art style is much better this time around. So all in all there is an improvement here, although not in all aspects. That being said, the lighting model is visibly improved over the first game. Now, the original used light sourcing to a decent effect in providing depth, but Tekken 2 kind of ups this to the next level. Yes, there's more depth on screen, but in this case, there's an increase in dynamic range from bright to dark areas, and this is used to provide atmosphere on certain stages, like Yoshimitsu's forest stage here. Animations also appear smoother as well, and generally the game has a far more fluid feel to it, and this can also be felt with the gameplay as well. While the original effectively introduced us to the basics, these are expanded upon greatly in this sequel. For example, character movesets are greatly expanded, and the whole concept of chain combos and juggles is also a lot more refined. There's more moves and bigger combos to do, and overall the general gameplay feels like it's coming together nicely. Whereas the original was kind of a proof of concept of sorts, Tekken 2 starts to feel like a real contender to Sega's Virtua Fighter franchise, and as a result it gained a lot more popularity both in the arcades and at home. So Tekken 2 brought the series to the masses, but in technical terms the game kind of fell short compared to the high-end arcade titles we were seeing, both on Sega's Model 2 board and Namco's System 22, which delivered significantly higher levels of detail and visual effects. And indeed in 1996 there was something of a 3D revolution going on. Sega were about to release the flagship Model 3 board, ushering in a new era of graphics technology into the arcades, something which no other company at the time could match. Even in 1996, when stacked against the Model 2 arcade board, the PlayStation hardware did appear dated from an arcade perspective. And when it came to Tekken 3, Namco needed more processing power in order to deliver a suitable leap forward. In this case, rather than move on to the more expensive System 22 board powering Ridge Racer, the company elected to stick with PlayStation 1 hardware, but overclocked. Processor speed is up from 33 MHz to 48 MHz, and as a result we get a lot more geometry processing power and memory bandwidth. And this was enough to deliver a considerable increase in graphical quality, even though on technical terms Tekken 3 was never going to compete against the high-end 3D fighting games like Virtua Fighter 3. But compared to Tekken 2, there's a big improvement here. For example, the flat 2D wallpapers from the previous two Tekken games are replaced by full 3D backgrounds, adding a lot more detail to the stages, fleshing out these environments in ways static backgrounds could not. And on top of that, the characters also feature increasing polygon counts too, combined with the use of both flat and gyro shading elements. Coloured lighting also enhances how the stages and characters are illuminated, adding more atmosphere to the presentation over Tekken 2 and indeed the original game. And on top of that, there are brand new animations for all of the characters, which means pulling off chain combos and moves in general appear much smoother. In fact, this is one of the biggest changes in Tekken 3. It's not just the visuals, but the gameplay. The previous Tekken games felt a little bit clunky, and arguably Tekken 3 is the first title which really polishes off the gameplay to a sufficiently high standard. This is kind of Namco's Virtua Fighter 2 moment, if you will. Moves and combos flow far more fluidly into each other, and there's a sense that the clunkiness from the previous games, although it's still there, no longer impacts upon the gameplay. The game certainly feels more like a serious contender to Sega's flagship franchise, along with being an excellent fighting game in its own right. The whole experience is rounded off by a significant boost in resolution. 240p is gone. Instead, the game renders at 384 by 480 in interlaced format, delivering a sharper, more refined presentation, more in line with medium resolution arcade monitors that were popular way back in 1996. On the whole, this is probably the biggest upgrade the series saw at the time, and while the visual quality isn't going to match something like Virtua Fighter 3, you are still getting a visual experience that you couldn't have at home. In 1999, Namco would roll out the PlayStation-based System 12 hardware for one last Tekken game, Tekken Tag Tournament. This isn't a sequel to Tekken 3, but kind of an upgrade. The ability to choose two characters and tag between them in a match, along with tightened up gameplay mechanics, are the real upgrades in terms of the core Tekken gameplay. Visually though, there really isn't that much difference to Tekken 3. The action is zoomed in a little more, making the characters appear larger, and there's also a small uptick in polygon detail across the game. The stages have been reworked so that we have different details in the backgrounds, and fights are set at different times of day. But on a technical level, there isn't too much of an upgrade here. Some stages feature an increase in geometry, others just look different. and likewise the character models are very similar. There's a sense that Namco are certainly maxing out the PlayStation hardware here, and the overall upgrade path using this technology was somewhat limited, although what I find interesting here is how Namco have simulated certain effects only found on ultra high-end arcade boards at the time, namely specular highlights and diffuse reflections across certain environment surfaces. Now the PlayStation 1 hardware couldn't possibly handle these effects natively, so what Namco appears to have done is baked these onto textures across certain surfaces. The effect isn't particularly convincing, but it does add an extra level of sprucing up to the presentation compared to Tekken III. At this point we get the feeling that perhaps Namco were held back by PlayStation 1 hardware and were eagerly anticipating PlayStation 2 to deliver that generational leap forward. After all, Sega had already taken several steps beyond Namco's high-end System 22 board. Just look at Model 3 for example, and of course there was the Naomi Dreamcast hardware just coming out. In order to make that generational cutting-edge leap forward, Namco needed brand new hardware to do so, and PlayStation 2 was just around the corner. Revealed in 1999, their PlayStation 2 hardware went beyond current arcade technology. Sony weren't promising arcade quality games in the home, they were focused on delivering CGI-like visuals in real time in games. And it was something that was demonstrated at the time with some very impressive technical demos, including one by Namco, the famous Tekken demo, showcasing a level of visual quality that we'd never seen before in gaming, and it looked stunning. Namco would take this level of technology and use it to develop Tekken Tag for PlayStation 2. Now, in terms of the gameplay, this is the exact same game that's present on the PS1 based arcade version. There's not a new game here, but on a visual level, everything has been completely reworked from the ground up, and it's absolutely incredible. There was nothing like it at the time, and for all intents and purposes, Namco were one of the few companies to initially deliver on Sony's CGI style aesthetic for gaming in the home. Now Tekken Tag Tournament represents a massive step up in both graphical complexity and the level of visual effects on show. For a start, polygon counts are massively upped over the previous Tekken titles, and there's a level of geometric detail here that goes well beyond anything on Sega's Model 3 board or the Dreamcast. To put things into perspective, Soul Calibur on Dreamcast pushes around 1 million polygons per second tops, whereas Tekken Tag Tournament metrics vary between 1.8 to 2.4 million, with the game usually hovering around the 2 million mark. Twice as much geometry as at the time one of the cutting-edge Dreamcast titles, and it shows. Geometry details are used to embellish floors and walls with individual 3D brickwork, and certain stages also feature stuff like 3D grass that's fully interactive, bending as the characters move and fall on these elements. But the increase in geometry detail is really only half the story. What makes this game special for its time is its CGI-like aesthetic, and this is only made possible by the huge levels of memory bandwidth available to the PlayStation 2, a whopping 50 GB per second, and this is really used to embellish the entire game, the characters and the environments, with a variety of different multi-pass effects. So, specular and diffuse reflections are used across various surfaces in order to dictate different levels of sheen between, say, concrete, wood and the character's skin. And there's a lot of variety here. Namco's attention to detail is really quite exceptional. These effects are also backed up by things such as faked reflection across pools of water on the floor, using what looks like a moving texture map. And of course there's things such as simulated bloom, light shafts, and a variety of different lighting effects, from massive spotlights to ambient local lights. Really, it's the combination of high polygon counts with aggressive use of effects which give this game its striking look, and it's something that I feel that Namco have never really quite matched again, at least on PlayStation 2 hardware. Of course, it's not quite a perfect presentation. At the time, Namco are using 640 by 448 resolution in interlaced format, rendering using field rendering, and that essentially means that odd and even lines are rendered at different times rather than in a sequential order as you'd find in a progressive scan presentation. And this means that in the original Japanese release at least, there's more jaggies visible on screen to, say, a lot of titles released on the Dreamcast. This was fixed for the Western releases in America and in PAL territories, using a form of line blending of sorts, faked anti-aliasing technique. This smooths over the presentation nicely but does add some blur to the texture detail. But overall I think it is a very good compromise and helped to add a level of solidness to the visuals to make it really convincing. That being said, the underlying gameplay here is really based on the PlayStation 1 era titles. The Tekken III gameplay system basically tweaked to perfection. Namco wouldn't really push the boundaries of the series on gameplay terms until the next title, Tekken IV. Released in summer 2001, Tekken IV represents the biggest shake-up the series has ever seen. Clearly Namco are influenced by Sega's Virtua Fighter 3 here. For a start, the gameplay takes place in full 3D interactive stages. The infinite plane levels of the previous Tekken games are gone. This time characters can be smashed up against the scenery and you can use this to get extra juggle combos or simply to pressurize the opponent in a fight. It's a great technique, though not the most popular at the time. There's also a position switch move allowing you to get out of a corner in tight situations, and Namco have even implemented undulation across various stages, the use of uneven surfaces which adds another dynamic to the gameplay. I actually think this is really cool and probably the most innovative Namco have been in terms of designing a Tekken installment, pushing the series forward. There's also been extensive reworking of the animation system. The blending between motion captured animation and hand corrected keyframes is handled beautifully here. The game appears very smooth and pulling off various combos and watching the animation, it all looks very fluid. Certainly a massive step up over Tekken Tag Tournament running on PlayStation 2. And of course the gameplay is bolstered by brand new moves and combos for all the characters. It really feels like this is Tekken taken to the next level. In visual terms, we're looking at a kind of sideways upgrade here. So in terms of resolution we get a boost. It's still 640 by 448, but now the game renders in progressive scan, so that gives the image a sharper, more solid presentation compared to the field rendered Tekken Tag Tournament. And there's also a lot more in terms of visual effects going on. Namco continue to layer on the various layers of specular and diffuse reflections across environment and characters, though I think there's less variety this time around compared to the previous release. There are some other cool techniques as well. The use of bloom is far more pronounced on various backgrounds, but perhaps the most striking aspect is the recreation of 3D water. It's not interactive per se, with a lovely specular component, and is also transparent so you can see what's below the water's surface. I think it looks really cool for its time, and there's a sense that Namco still wanted to keep the CGI feel in the game, although this particular title doesn't quite embellish that look as much as Tekken Tag did. I mentioned that the game is a sideways upgrade of sorts, and that's because there are certain cutbacks in a few areas. Texture quality is more inconsistent compared to Tekken Tag Tournament. There's also a reduction in polygon counts, although according to Namco themselves, this was done because they felt that the amount of geometry used in Tekken Tag Tournament was wasteful, particularly on the characters. So for example, characters are created of roughly 6,000 to 7,000 polygons in Tekken Tag Tournament, whereas in Tekken IV this is reduced to around sort of 2,000, 2,500 polygons. And if you look closely then you can see that the character models aren't quite as detailed, they're a little bit blockier in places. That said, the level of animation is massively improved here. Facial expressions are far more dynamic and natural, and overall, even though the actual complexity of the characters are a bit of a step down from Tekken Tag, the way they move and they act on screen is far more realistic. So it's an improvement in one area. And the same thing can be said of the backgrounds too. There's definitely a reduction in geometric complexity there, although Namco have tried to spruce things up with stronger use of lighting and more pronounced effects, even if there's perhaps slightly less variety in terms of the way different surfaces are represented. Tekken 4 is kind of a polarizing game. You either love it or you're not too keen on it. Personally, I really appreciate what Namco have done in terms of pushing the boundaries of the Tekken series forward. I like the fact that they weren't willing to simply stand still and instead take some big risks in order to bring the series up to date. While it's not the best game in the series, I think it's still a thoroughly excellent title worth checking out. Namco would go on to refine the fundamentals established with Tekken IV with the 2004 release of Tekken V, also running on PlayStation 2 hardware, though a slightly higher clocked variant, which gave the arcade version more geometric detail compared to the PlayStation 2 edition. Here we're looking at the PlayStation 2 release, but for the most part I think it faithfully showcases the changes Namco made when moving between Tekken 4 and 5. For a start, the art style of the characters is very similar to Tekken 4, which arguably gave birth to the modern Tekken look in terms of how the characters appear anyway, but you'll note that geometry complexity has gone back up. In fact, both characters and environments are visibly more detailed this time around, and polygon counts generally range between 1.4 to 1.6 million, though they do go up to 2.2 million. So realistically the game's kind of in between Tekken 4 and Tekken Tag for the majority of the time. There are other changes as well. The level of texture quality has been ramped up compared to Tekken 4, with more intricate detail across brickwork, mud and various other surfaces. In other areas the use of bloom and extensive lighting remains, and the lighting model here seems to be kind of a refinement of what we saw in Tekken 4, although there are some interesting new effects. For example, there's a lovely simulated bloom effect on this particular stage here. The PlayStation 2's memory bandwidth is also put to good use in rendering lots of alpha effects, such as this stage here, which features tons of fire as the surrounding trees and buildings are burning to the ground. Cool stuff indeed. The game also renders natively at 640 by 448 in progressive scan as well, so you get the same sort of crisp, sharp image quality that was present in Tekken 4. In terms of the visuals then, Namco have certainly gone out to upgrade certain aspects, the texturing and geometric complexity. In turn, the CGI style aesthetic has been dialed back in order to let other parts of the artwork shine. And this is used to create perhaps the definitive Tekken look, the final sort of art style Namco would build upon for successive Tekken titles. It's not just the visuals that have seen changes, the gameplay has also been reworked in a number of areas. For a start, the core mechanics and timings have been tightened up compared to Tekken 4, which felt a little bit loose, and the kind of position switch move that people didn't really like has been removed. Of course, there's still environments where you can smash characters up against the walls, but these have been reduced, allowing for generally more balanced gameplay. There are some nice touches as well though, such as limited environment destruction. Smash a character up against the wall and you can see the brickwork crumble. Likewise, have a character fall to the floor and the ground shatters. Pretty cool stuff, something that was present in Virtua Fighter 4 a couple of years ago, but it's great to see Namco implement this into a Tekken game. Namco would later go on to refine the gameplay model in Tekken Dark Resurrection, though from a visual perspective there isn't much changes here. Yeah, some of the backgrounds are set at different times of day and there are brand new backgrounds, but on a technical level it's more of a subtle refinement over Tekken 5 than anything else. The game was converted to the PSP and then later to PlayStation 3, and in fact the PlayStation 3 version is the first time we see a Tekken title running in high definition. The game runs at native 1080p and looks pretty sharp on a full HD screen. Essentially you could consider this one of the first HD remasters, and the results are generally very good. Aside from resolution, there aren't really any visual upgrades to speak of. However, due to the differences in hardware between PlayStation 3 and PlayStation 2, some of the effects work doesn't translate quite so well. So the cool bloom effect created on PlayStation 2 is replaced with a kind of simple blur effect on PS3. Aside from these graphical oddities though, Tekken V Dark Resurrection is an excellent way to play the game, and overall it's probably the most refined version of Tekken V available. The next big leap would come with Tekken VI, with the switch to PlayStation 3 hardware, and the game represents a true generational leap over Tekken V. I mean, pretty much in every area we see graphical upgrades, from the character and environment modelling, the level of detail on offer, to the effects work and lighting. The PlayStation 3 is a very different beast to PS2. The kind of brute force rendering style of PlayStation 2, where there'd be different texture layers being rendered in order to create fancy effects, is replaced by the use of pixel and vertex shaders. And this opens up a whole different way of rendering complex effects work, creating a brand new look for the game. But I guess the main difference is of course the switch to high definition. In the arcades, Tekken VI runs on PlayStation 3 based hardware and renders at 1280 by 720p. Though this was dropped to 1024 by 720 with Tekken Bloodline Rebellion due to the inclusion of per object blur during the pre and post fight sequences. On consoles it's a bit of a mishmash. There's different resolutions depending whether you play on PS3 and 360. We're using the PlayStation 3 version here, but both versions with motion blur enabled run at 576p. And I guess that's where we should start. This is the big thing with Tekken VI, the use of per object blur. This adds an extra level of intensity and fluidity to the fights. It kind of builds on Namco's CG filmic style look present in Tekken Tag Tournament, but takes it in a different direction. I think the effect works quite well, although I'm not too keen on the resolution drop it incurs. But you can definitely see why Namco were kind of experimenting. It suits the general grittiness of the Tekken art style rather well. In other areas you get all of the expected refinements from modern rendering technology. Advanced pixel shaders mean that different environmental surfaces can look a bit more realistic, particularly on the characters, which feature skin shaders that resemble more of a CG-like presentation. And of course along with that we get high dynamic range quality lighting, along with day and night transitions for certain stages. Animations are also completely reworked, and I think this is the last time where this aspect of the game has been sort of completely redone to this extent, something we haven't really seen since. What we've got here builds upon the fluidity present in Tekken IV, but brings it to a new level. Certain keyframes are still present, but the kind of animation blending again is another step up, and it looks very nice indeed. Of course, there's also a massive increase in terms of detail. Characters appear fuller, while the use of higher resolution textures and normal maps now allow for more intricate details to be resolved across character clothing and the skin. Something that simply wasn't possible on PlayStation 2. And of course, general complexity is considerably increased across the board. From a gameplay perspective, characters get new moves and there are a few new systems in place. The bounce system allows you to bounce the opponent off the ground mid-combo, thus extending that combination, dealing extra damage in the process. And there's something called the rage system. When your health is low, your character glows red and then enhances you, giving you extra power. Controversial tweaks to the gameplay system, but something to keep things fresh, as the general basic format remains mostly unchanged from Tekken V. There is of course the ability to smash characters through the ground, i.e. there's 2 tiered stages, which is pretty cool actually, and something that Namco continues to implement in successive Tekken titles. Moving on to Tekken Tag Tournament 2, and this game represents more of a refinement of what we saw in Tekken VI. In terms of the resolution, we're now looking at a dynamic frame buffer. So things start off at native 1280 by 720 but drop below when there's 2 characters on screen or in really hectic moments when there's lots of alpha based effects. The game can be played in tag mode where you select 2 characters and switch between them, or in standard one-on-one mode where the resolution stays more stable at 720p. In terms of the visual upgrades, there's more detail on screen, geometry counts have been upped, characters have been remodeled, and there's a sense that the general environments feel a little bit more fuller this time around. Visually, the refinements come in the form of more accurate lighting, so bloom is much less overstated than it was in Tekken VI. And generally there's more of a balance in the way that characters and the surrounding environment is illuminated. Naturally, there are various tweaks to shader effects present again, providing a more sort of natural look, along with more refined effects such as wet shaders on the characters. Post-processing effects such as per object motion blur return, and there's also a light use of depth of field as well. Overall, we don't get the same kind of leap we saw when going between Tekken Tag, Tekken IV and Tekken V here. Really, Tekken 6 to Tekken Tag is more of a small evolutionary step visually. And so this brings us on to Tekken VII, and the game which finally concludes the storyline that began way back in 1994 with the original Tekken release. On a technical level though, there's some interesting shifts in rendering. For a start, Namco have ditched their own in-house technology in favour of Unreal Engine 4, and yeah, you'll be pleased to know there's none of the kind of rubbery, plasticky look associated with Unreal Engine 3. Essentially, this is the Tekken art style ramped up for the current generation. And it's pretty impressive stuff for the most part at least. In terms of resolution, the arcade game was targeting native 1080p I believe, but on consoles, depending on which platform you choose, you're going to be getting a different output. For example, base PS4 is running at 864p. Beyond resolution though, and there's lots of changes afoot. Okay, so yes, graphical complexity has increased once again in both characters and the environment, and that's really to be expected. The characters have been fleshed out with far more intricate details and the environments are more populated. But really the biggest change is the use of true physically based rendering. And this basically allows for far more realistic depiction of various materials, from things like concrete, glass, marble, and of course to the character's skin shaders. Although it's worth mentioning that character's skin does look a little plasticky in this particular release. It seems like Namco have tried to target a kind of classic 90s CGI look. It's perhaps gone a little too far, but one thing I will say is it's certainly striking. The other big change comes in the use of an increase in post-process effects, namely film grain. Yeah, it's not so surprising. Tekken was aiming for a cinematic approach in the last couple of years, and that's something we see here. With story modes, scenes that take place, say 20 years ago, feature a heavy amount of film grain, whereas say arcade mode, this is dialed back slightly. It adds a distinct sort of filmic look to the presentation, which is, well, I actually think it works quite well, but is a little bit unusual in a fighting game, and sometimes it appears layered on a little thick. But it's an interesting choice at least, and kind of works well with the depth of field and other post-processing elements that's been applied here. Other elements such as ambient occlusion also flesh out the game's look, adding extra depth to the scene, as does improvements in per pixel lighting and shading in general. Animations see a smaller tweak. In this case, there's no real big jump like going between Tekken Tag 1 and Tekken 4, and then again from say Tekken 5 to Tekken 6. There's more of a gentle refinement here. One thing that does stand out though is the physics-based properties on clothing such as Kazuya Mishima's coat. And this is an aspect that definitely appears more realistic than in previous games. Overall, I think Tekken 7 is generally a great looking game, but what's really fascinating for me is just how far we've come from the PlayStation 1 era. It's been incredible to go back, replay these games, and see how the franchise has progressed from console to console, seeing how the developers have had to make use of different rendering techniques as technology has progressed throughout the generations. And what can I say? It's been pretty cool to see exactly what the changes are and how this has affected the gameplay. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed our look back through Tekken history, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, then let us know in the comments down below. Anyway, as ever, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you like the content we produce at Digital Foundry, and I'll catch you next time.